Thank you for joining us tonight. Really glad to have you all here. My name is Kate Becker. I'm the director of the Office of Film and Music for the City of Seattle. We have a very special guest this evening who will be taking the stage shortly. But before we do that, I just want to say we've moved our mixers down to Seattle Center. This is our first night at KEXP. Oh my goodness, we love it here. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Thank you to Tom and Michelle and everyone at KEXP for having us. Really, really fabulous. Thank you to Seattle Film Institute for being here as our partner and filming these events. And of course to Slade and Alex and Laura who are helping make this happen. There's a bar in the back of the room, and if we want a caterer to be at our event serving drinks, well, we need to support the caterer, just saying. So, two things I want to tell you about, and then I will get off this stage. City of Music Career Day happening March 31st. Look it up if you're interested. It's really a great opportunity for anyone trying to make a career in the music industry. Tons of Seattle's music industry professionals come out and volunteer their whole day. It's super fun. Also, next month we are at the Vera Project next door with Ventures, talking about some more nuts and bolts ways of making a living in the creative economy, sort of following up on what John is talking about tonight with more hands-on nuts and bolts kinds of things. So, with that, it is my distinct honor to introduce you to Mr. John Roderick, who, I don't want to ruin his story, so I'm not going to tell you all the things I know about him, but you are about to be properly entertained and maybe a little bit enlightened. So, come on up here, John.
Thank you, Kate. Thank you all for coming to the mixer. Thank you, Miss, for switching your position so I wasn't looking at your computer through the whole thing. I'm going to be giving a talk about how to make a living as a creative person. And, of course, that's a really, it's an individual thing. Everyone who makes a living as a creative person does it in their own unique way. And I remember when I was young feeling like there was a secret or a series of secrets that someone could teach me or that I could learn. And of course, if there were secrets, if there was a series of secrets, everyone would know them and we would all be doing them, right? If you could do some trick and sell 100,000 records, it would be a thing we were all trying. So there isn't really a set of secrets, but I can only tell you about what my life in Seattle has been, starting out as a 20-year-old transplant who had really no talent or plan, and now here I am, someone widely renowned, a 49-year-old who's missing his front tooth. Truly a sign that I'm thriving. You could all be so lucky as to be 50 years old and still be dentally challenged. But and I love the fact that it's all these individuals sitting alone at tables. Like, it really does feel good. You in the back are welcome to come forward if you want. You don't have to. The first thing I want to talk about is fame. And I mean fame as an ambition separate from a desire to make good creative work. We have a lot, particularly in Seattle, a lot of negative feelings about the pursuit of fame. Fame is something that we expect will be the result of, and often the unpleasant result of, doing good work. That's our Seattle mentality. There are other places in the world, Miami, for instance, is its own end. And typically we are contemptuous of people who are famous for being famous. Here, the expectation is that you will somewhat shun fame. That certainly was true when I first arrived here during the grunge years. People were famous for hating being famous, which is a very distinctive Seattle approach. But there's another way of thinking about fame, and that is fame in terms of reputation, fame in terms of being known. and known for doing good things. And that's a separate job, really, from being an artist. You can be a great artist and be terrible at being famous. And that really impacts how you're able to deliver your message, how much of a positive influence you are in the world. You can be a great artist and terrible at being famous, and it colors the way people receive your message. And ultimately, as artists and creative people, we have a message that we want people to hear and understand. And when I first arrived in Seattle, I only knew a few chords on the guitar. I had no real ambition to be a musician. But from a young age, I did want to be famous. And immediately when I say that, I'm ashamed of it somewhat, right? Like, what kind of ambition is that, to be famous? But I was raised to want to help people. And I understood that if you had a name, if you had a reputation, you could use that. It was a power, right? Jimmy Carter has continued to be relevant for decades after the end of his presidency because he had a reputation as someone who could get things done, positive things. And when I arrived here and the grunge scene was happening, I watched a lot of people be really bad at being famous, and it was super frustrating. The country at the time really wanted one of us, at least, to be the voice of a generation. They kept saying it over and over in Time magazine articles. This person's the voice of a generation, that person's the voice of a generation. And most of the famous rock stars from Seattle responded to that by going, I don't care. And I remember watching it and thinking, God, if I could just be the famous part of Kurt Cobain and let him just do the grunge, I would do so much better of a job at it. And the other thing that influenced me being a musician was that grunge rock was mostly terrible. We don't remember it. The few bands that we remember are the only good ones. The rest were awful. And so I really felt inspired, and I picked up a guitar and felt like this shouldn't be that hard. And I started to try, and it was really the first time in my life that I ever tried. I tried to be a musician. I tried to get good at guitar. I tried to make my voice heard. And it really felt like there were so many walls between me and that. You know, there was a very closed scene here, it felt like. And how to get through it, how to get in, how to be acknowledged. It was excruciating, and I know that this is true, I think, for most people when they're young. It feels like old people are controlling everything. How do you get past them? And when you're 22, old people are 24, right? It's not like old people, it's like the people that were here 2 years before you got here. It turns out Seattle's music scene and culture is incredibly generous, actually. We really support each other and support ourselves. That's not how it felt to me when I first got here. It felt like I had missed it. I had missed the opportunity. I had missed the scene. But I was hungry. I wanted to be somebody. And there were a lot of people in Seattle that were famous and they weren't musicians. Dan Savage was getting renowned at this same time. Megan Jasper, who now is the president of Sub Pop Records, and who then was the receptionist, got famous just for being snarky to the New York Times, which was exactly the kind of fame I wanted. Just be snarky to the New York Times and everybody knows you? It's so much easier than playing guitar. But I couldn't get into the local scene. We would make demo tapes after demo tapes, take them to clubs. We would play first of 3 on a Tuesday night. We would call the Crocodile the following day and get the recording and leave a message. Hey, how about it? We got 60 people to our show last night. Never get a reply. If I went to the Crocodile, they would say, why don't you send us a demo? And I would say, I've sent you 5 demos. And they would say, how's first of 3 on a Tuesday night? Like it was brutally hard, and I watched other people succeed, and and it hurt. And what I didn't realize was that the other bands around me at the time who also were struggling and were flailing, we were coalescing into a music scene. None of us realized it at the time. We were all looking at the Seattle music scene and wondering how to get in, and it turned out we were the next Seattle music scene, unconscious of the fact that we were that was happening, right? Because we started to play Thursday nights, and we started to play shows with each other. We would look for each other and ask to be on one another's bills. And so suddenly this world of bands that was higher, Mock Tube and Goodness and the Walkabouts, and these bands that seemed unattainably big, gave way to these shows that were bands like Death Cab for Cutie and Modest Mouse, who could sell, at the time, 250 tickets. And we became a Seattle music scene. And it felt really good. I remember my first record came out, and it was #1 in Seattle. There used to be a chart in The Stranger that talked about, they went around to the record stores, a thing that used to exist. And they would ask how many records, who sold the most locally. And my record was #1, and it was the highest ambition I'd ever had at the time. I didn't know how you would sell a single record in San Francisco. But we were #1 here. And it was because we were part of this new indie rock, is what it was called. And it began a period of my life where I worked 18 hours a day. I worked 18 hours a day on tour, making music, and in general I averaged about $900 a month in income. I realized that I had to say yes to everything. I was not somebody that was a genius right out of the gate. I wasn't a 21-year-old Neil Young who wrote Harvest and made a classic album before he could grow a mustache. I was already 30. Thank you for your contribution. It was a period when I said yes to everything, every offer. There was no thing too small. I played every benefit show I was asked to play. Our first tours, we were lucky to make $100 a show. And that was at a time when we had to put gas in the van and stay in hotels or stay on people's floors. It was the classic thing, the classic rock story that when I talk to musicians now, it seems alien to them, right? Now you have success by putting your music up online and people either respond to it or not. We used to really have to brutalize ourselves. And I think that's still true. You have to brutalize yourself somehow. But I realized about 10 years into my career that I wasn't going to get famous. The bands that were going to get famous, you saw them. They shot past me. The Decemberists opened for the Long Winters, and then they would never open for us again, right? They went from selling a few records to selling hundreds of thousands. Death Cab for Cutie opened for us. The Shins and Band of Horses, they all came out of Seattle. Brandi Carlile, I couldn't believe what happened. I knew her when she was playing in cafes, and then all of a sudden she's enormous. And I had to reckon with the fact that we weren't going to be big. I wasn't going to be big. But I didn't want to get a job. And the funny thing about fame in the creative world is it isn't calibrated against anything else. It's really hard to say how successful an artist is. It always looks like other artists are more successful to you. And no one really knows how many records bands sell. Nobody really knows how much people's art is worth. And I found that although the long winters weren't making me rich, people knew my name. And I started getting offers to do things that were only tangentially related to being a musician. Would I write a column for CMJ magazine where I reviewed the bands at Bonnaroo? What a weird job. Didn't pay anything, but I said yeah. Would I write a column for the Seattle Weekly? Sure. And the perception of me, I think, as a Seattleite and as a musician was that I was bigger than I was. And I started saying yes to things that I would have maybe felt were humiliating when I was starting out, because they went against the idea of having credibility as a rocker. But my say yes to everything policy had gotten me at least as far as I'd gotten. And after 15 years in the music business, I realized that over the course of the entire time, I had made about $300,000, which seems like an enormous amount of money until you amortize it over 15 years, which is $20,000 a year. And I'd heard this from other musicians. You know, you get a record contract, you get $1 million to sign, you immediately give away 40% in taxes. You pay 10% to your lawyer and 10% to your manager. And then you split it 4 ways. Everybody makes about $100,000. But you're perceived to be a big deal, $1 million record contract. So at a crucial point in my music career, I was embarrassed to say that all I felt was disappointment. I had not achieved success. I have a long-standing joke. My record sold about 35,000 copies. I have about 35,000 Twitter followers. My podcast has about 35,000 listeners. And 35,000 Seattleites voted for me when I ran for city council. Thank you. 35,000 people is not a career, but 35,000 people, 5 different places, kind of is. And the key to me came in a conversation I had with another Seattle musician, whose name is Ken Stringfellow. Does anyone here remember Ken Stringfellow? Ken was one of the singers of a band called the Posies, and they were a big Seattle band. And he and I were friends, and we came home from tour one time, and we were sitting in his kitchen, and we'd been gone for about a month, and there was a big stack of envelopes. And Ken said, "Sit down, I want to teach you something." And Ken was 2 months younger than I was, so I was very resistant to him teaching me anything. But he started to open his mail, and he said, "Here's a check for $120 that I got for producing a 7-inch for a Dutch record label." And he opened another envelope and he said, "Here's a check for $82 for radio play of one of our songs in Argentina. Here's a check for $400 for the sale of some compilation record we were on." And he continued to open these envelopes. And it was checks between $50 and $500, one after another. And I sat there in the chair smirking because I thought he was about to open a check for $10,000. I thought that this was a brag session and that he was going to open some rock star checks. But he kept opening these envelopes, and they kept being these little piddly checks that a lot of musicians I knew at the time, if they'd been offered a show for $180, they would have turned it down. They would have thought they were too big of a deal. But here he was opening these checks, and by the end of this session, he had a stack of checks, and it was $10,000. And he said, this is how you make a living as a musician. $160 check at a time. And it blew my mind, and it has stuck with me to this day. And it turns out it's how I make a living as a musician. One $180 check at a time. This past year, I made a lot of big mistakes. I recently accepted a diagnosis of bipolar. I had known it for years. I just didn't accept it. But I accepted it, and I started taking medication for it, and it helped me. But the first thing that happened was I bought a vintage RV, because it took me a few months to calibrate how much medicine I needed. And I was like, I feel great. I'm going to buy a vintage RV, and it took a bunch of money away. And by October of this last year, I didn't have any money. I was out of money. I hadn't let myself get there in a long time because these little checks keep coming. I had no money, and I had no money coming in. I had no gigs planned. And between October and the first of the year, these little checks, these little nothing checks just kept coming. And by the end of the year, I had made a living. I'd paid my mortgage, I'd kept gas in my vintage RV, like I had done it in a way that I couldn't have, if I had panicked, there's no way I would have believed it. And it's a result of having accepted that my fame is my job. And by fame, honestly, I mean this much fame. But that's what I do. I do podcasts, I do speeches like this, I do presentations, I do shows still. But I have a reputation as somebody who can extemporize a speech like this. I mean, I wrote some things down on this piece of paper, which I haven't looked at. It's probably a much better speech. Yeah, pretty much everything is here. Earlier this year, I was asked to be King Neptune for Seafair 2017, which is an incredible honor in Seattle. Right? If my dad were alive and were able to know that I had been King Neptune, my God, he would have felt like it's basically like being mayor, but with no responsibility, and nobody yells at you about sidewalks in Lake City. But it didn't pay anything. And people all year long ask me, how do you get to be King Neptune? Who asks you? Why would they ask you? I didn't have an answer. It was that I have become a Seattle guy, right? Famous for what? Nobody knows. Certainly not for being the guy from the Long Winters. We haven't put out a record since 2006. So making a living as a creative person, for me, has been a continuing process of being always on the razor's edge of failure. I do not, by any means, have the career I expected. You couldn't have designed it. I couldn't have known in 1991 when I showed up here that I would be King Neptune one day for nothing. for no reason, really. But here I am, and I still have never had a job since I quit Steve's Broadway News in 1998 to go on my first tour. I've never had a job other than this. Now, you could live in Seattle for $900 a month for most of that time. And now you can't. And I sit on the Seattle Music Commission, and we're working constantly to figure out a way that you can still be an artist in this town and not get pushed out and not have your spirit crushed before you have a chance to limp your way into a career. Because limping your way into a career has always been a way that people do it, and now it feels impossible. How do you limp your way into a career? You have to live in a one-bedroom apartment with 6 other people. It's something, right, that we're conscious of, but it's a real danger now that Seattle is going to be like San Francisco. We're going to lose a whole generation of people that just can't afford to make art here. I was just in San Francisco and talked to some musicians at a show I was playing, and they said, none of us live here. We all live in LA or other towns. We come to San Francisco because there are all these empty venues, because there are no bands in San Francisco anymore, but they still have all these great clubs. It was like, oh, please don't let that happen to Seattle. But it's kind of happening, and a lot of my experience is only spiritually relevant to people that are trying to make music now. I can't directly advise people how to figure out those magic steps. Only that it is possible to be someone with medium talent and medium success, to put together that stack of little checks and make a name for yourself, which doesn't ring out in the halls of history, but is a name synonymous with a certain thing, with a certain kind of quality, with a certain voice. I feel like it's still available to everyone if you have that voice. And you feel strongly enough that you want other people to hear it. So with that, normally when I do a talk like this, it's a lot funnier, and I get by on being funny a lot more. This feels really serious. Like we've been having a serious talk about serious shit, and it's not really. I didn't know podcasts existed until I had one. And now it's a big part of my career. I just started a podcast with Ken Jennings from Jeopardy, who lives here in Seattle. Why the hell does he know me, you know? He knows me because he met me at Bumbershoot because I said yes to some dumb thing. And he said yes to it too because he doesn't have any more sense than I do. One more thing about saying yes, there is a moment when you have to start saying no to things. And that is really hard to know when that moment is. A lot of people make the mistake of thinking that moment comes before it does. A lot of times when people offer you $100 for a thing, that's all you're going to get for it. And if you say no, they find somebody else. But there is a moment when they offer you $100 and you say no, and then they come back with $500, and you say, if you had $500, why did you offer me $100? And they're like, hey, it's not called show friends. You need to figure where that moment is out for yourselves, right? Everybody has to figure out that moment when they can first say no to something and feel confident. But you know, Ken Jennings said, will you do some dumb thing with me? He wanted me to be in a video for his book promotion, and I said yes. And now we're doing a podcast together, and it's a quarter of my income for this year. I'm going to kind of leave it, I guess, at that because I feel like questions and a question and answer period will be hopefully useful. I'm happy to take as many questions as you have. So, so that concludes the lesson, I guess. Thank you. It's a very live room, so I don't know if we need microphones to ask questions. Does everyone feel comfortable just shouting out?
Hell yeah.
Let's hear questions. Yes.
What were things that were either little checks or big checks that were revenue streams that surprised you in either direction? They were like, that made a ton more than I thought, or like, wow, we thought that would be a thing.
You know, you want to think that record sales or music sales are going to be a significant part of your income as a musician. And even when we sold records, it was surprisingly less than I thought it would be. And now the way that world has changed and music is just sort of, I mean, people pay what they want, which often is nothing. I don't get paid as much for music, for the actual music. I was astonished at how much Hollywood would pay to use music in their things. He is worth. And there was a whole period where they were just paying what seemed to be, I mean, they would use my song in the OC, and I would get paid 4 times what it cost to make the entire record. And they thought it was hilarious. They thought they were getting away with murder. These guys up in Seattle, you know, they'll take half what we paid for catering to use their music. And we were like, and because they were used to dealing with the Rolling Stones. And so there was a period where bands from here got paid pretty well for song usage. That money has dried up too, but it still is significant. I mean, in terms of, I don't know anybody that, well, I know a couple of people that will turn their nose up at a $5,000 check, but nobody here, right? And a $5,000 check to use some of your music as interstitial music on MTV's, MTV's Dummies, it's money. And more money than you think, right? To get a $5,000 gig is a big deal, and that can be this weird income stream. And it's hard. It's hard to get into that world because they don't want your music if it has too many words or too many smart words. They don't want, they want your music to be a kind of thing. Right now, they want it to sound like Portugal the Man. A year from now, they'll want it to sound like something else. But there's money there in putting your music weird places. Yes?
I don't know if you can answer this according to how times have changed and the way that people do business, like you said, online, but looking back over how you did business then and how you do it now, what would you have changed and maybe what different decisions would you have made back then that we could apply to today?
There's luck in everything. Every single moment there's luck. And when your luck is good, you think it's always going to be good. It's just a factor. I mean, the first time I made $40,000, I thought that I was always going to make $40,000 from then on. And knowing how to capitalize on luck is it requires that you be one level of altitude above yourself, to be able to kind of situate yourself in your own moment and know, like, oh, this is a lucky break. What do I do about it? It's hard not to be strivey in those moments. I heard one time somebody through the scuttlebutt said, Cameron Crowe really loves your music. I was like, Cameron Crowe, famous for putting music in his films, loves my band? And I made 20 phone calls that week. Hey, do you know Cameron Crowe? Hey, I know you know someone who knows Cameron Crowe? But it gets ugly. You can't do that. Cameron Crowe gets 7 phone calls from people he knows that are like, John Roderick's trying to get in touch. You know, it's like, he doesn't want it. Nobody wants that. So, you know, looking back, there were a lot of moments when I had opportunity, and I didn't recognize it, and sometimes it was because of pride. In the very early days of Twitter, there were people at Twitter that liked me. They gave me a check mark really early. But when Colin Malloy joined Twitter, somebody at Twitter put his name on the auto follow list. If you joined Twitter, you followed Colin Malloy, whether you wanted to or not. And I knew the people that had done it because they had reached out to me, and I said, I felt like that was illegitimate. And then Colin Malloy had 1 million followers, and I had 8,000, which had been a huge deal immediately before. And who knew that 1 million followers on Twitter would translate into, in a lot of ways, into a career? Colin already has a career, he doesn't care. But it would have made a huge difference to me. And I was like too proud and didn't see the moment. But I don't know if you can give advice about that. You know, you just have to, in your time, just be like so conscious of those moments and knowing the right place on the line to not look gross or feel gross, but make the right move for yourself. It's the same line as knowing when to say, you know what, $500 isn't enough for me to do this show. And then they're like, will $2,500 do it? And you're like, yes. But I would have said yes to 500 like a week ago. You know, you have to feel it so hard. Kate.
So making a living $180 check at a time, John, commonly known as the gig economy, right? Lots of people making a living that way. This question might be a little personal, so feel free not to answer if you don't want to, but how did you justify to a bank that you had enough of those checks coming in to sign a mortgage?
Because I bought my house in the summer of 2007.
When anybody would buy it.
And I went into the bank, and the mortgage guy said, how much did you make last year? And I said, $150,000. And he said, how much did you make the year before that? And I said, $11,000. And he said, how much do you think you'll make next year? And I said, $300,000. And he said, you're not getting a big enough house. And I had 20% down in cash on a house that cost $300,000. And he said, 20% down with a tricky mortgage and a second dwiddly-do mortgage, you could buy an $800,000 house. And I said, I think a $300,000 house is right for me. And he was like, it's a missed opportunity. Well, 6 months later, my $300,000 house was worth $200,000, and nobody in the country could get a mortgage. Now, if you want to buy $1 million house, you have to come with a cash offer in Capitol Hill. Houses, I know a house that in 1998 was sold for $197,000 that just sold for $1.3 million. So I don't know, you know. I got lucky. I was underwater for about 6 years, but now I pay a lot less in a mortgage as you would to get a 1-bedroom apartment. So that was luck. And it was luck that I didn't get an $800,000, or not, maybe not luck. It was somewhat sensible that I didn't get like a house with a pool. No, wait, my house does have a pool, but there's no water in it. It's full of logs. But so, you know, a weird moment. I remember a guy that I knew in the rock scene who had bought a house on Capitol Hill that was one of those 10-bedroom North Capitol Hill homes, 4 stories and some home from 1880. that he bought for $150,000, and he sold it for 500 grand. You probably remember this character.
Was it Purple House?
It was that big purple house.
Yep. Wow.
He sold it for $500,000, and he was like, "See you later, suckers." I don't know, that house is worth $8 million now. You can never know. Yeah, how would we know, right? Yes.
Also, a awkwardly personal question, which you may choose to pass on.
I seldom do.
So, having recently been diagnosed with bipolar disorder, are there any cautionary tales from your past of being undiagnosed that you might like to share?
Throughout my career, because I was diagnosed with bipolar disorder in 1988,
Okay.
I just refused to accept that it was a real thing. You know, it just seemed like one of those things that people said to other people to make them take drugs that weren't approved. It just seemed like a weird thing to, I guess I didn't believe that it existed. And I lived as a creative person in a constant state of either sleeping 3 hours a day and forgetting to eat, or sleeping 18 hours a day and forgetting to eat. And I thought that was just the life. That's the life that we lead, right? I mean, I wrote all my songs in one or the other of those states, and I felt like I deserved it. You know, as a person making creative things, like you're already wrestling, you're struggling all the time, because you can't be making art and not be confronting the animals in you. And it just felt like these animals were my lot in life. It's why I had things to write about. And it only was as I got older and it got worse that I realized that I wasn't going to outgrow it. When I was 25 and I, just was like overwhelmed, it didn't feel like it was possible that would be true of me at 40. It seemed like immaturity, or that I was actually confused or actually confronted by the world as it was. I wasn't depressed because I was crazy or because I had an illness. I was depressed because I saw the truth.
Yeah.
And when I was manic, it wasn't that I was untreated, it was that I was the greatest person in the world for a while. And that whole thing of feeling like when you are depressed or suffering from mental illness, that feeling that you actually see the truth better than other people do, is what kept me unmedicated for 30 years. And when I went to a doctor and I was like, I feel like the world is ending all the time. And she said, "You are bipolar. I can tell as soon as you walked in the door." And I was like, yeah. That's what everybody says. And she said, "That's one of the ways we diagnose bipolar people. Because all their friends tell them that they're bipolar." And I was like, "Nah." And she said, "I didn't come see you, dude." And I was like, "Well, good point." And she gave me some medicine. And I finally got over myself enough to take it, and it actually worked. I'm up and down, but I don't.
Right.
And it's great. I highly recommend it if you feel like you're bipolar.
Yeah.
If you feel like you have borderline personality disorder, I'm sorry, there aren't medicines for it yet. But there are a lot of things that drugs don't work. Some, like 3% of the people that take Lamictal, which is what I take, their skin falls off and they die. Yeah. So you have to be careful, right? They gave me the drug and they were like, "If you get a rash, stop taking it immediately and come see us immediately, because your skin could fall off and you die." But it's only 3% of the people. The other 95% are great or whatever. And I was like, well, shit. All right. If that's the way I die, that'd be pretty dramatic. Anyway, so I didn't pursue treatment for my mental illness because I thought that I was getting what I deserved. And that's one thing I wish I could go back and do over.
Take better care of your health.
Take better care of myself, yeah. I mean, I still forget to eat, but, I mean, I'm not cured, right? But was that a good answer? Answer enough?
That was a great answer. I'm also curious, like how being medicated has impacted your creativity.
Well, that's the great fear, right? That you would take medication for depression and that a cloud would come over you. But there was a cloud over me all the time, a gauze across my perception that was unreal. You know, I was not seeing clearly. This particular medication, the doctor said, look, if you don't have bipolar disorder, this will not affect you. My psychiatrist said, I'm not bipolar, I could take this stuff by the handful, it has no effect. It's not like lithium where it makes your ears ring. It's just a thing. We don't even know why it works. This was the genius of it. The doctors were like, we don't know why this works. It's like licking a toad in the Amazon. We just gave it to people for seizures and it helped their bipolar. So now we give it to people for bipolar. We don't know why. We can't tell you. And I was like, that is exactly the thing I was looking for. Like some kind of magic bullet. So I got lucky, I guess. I mean, except for buying the RV. And I was in a really ill-advised relationship for about a year, but now I'm stable. Anybody else? Yes.
Can you talk about a time that you may have ruined a relationship that, with an industry person that may have affected your reputation? How did you move forward or did you reconcile?
Yeah, early on in my music career, when I first was achieving some fame around town, as a good musician, it was during a period when Sub Pop Records was kind of also trying to figure out what they were doing. They had a big success in the early days, and then they went through a period where they were just kind of shooting at rainbows, trying to identify what their new sound was. And John Poneman of Sub Pop came to see my band and came up to me afterwards and was like, I love your band. I want to sign you to Sub Pop, which was a big deal. And he took me to lunch and we palled around. We were like two peas in a pod for a few months while we worked out the deal. But during this period I was getting information. This was, in that middle period when the major labels were disintegrating and small labels were coming up. I was talking to these characters earlier about this famous letter that Steve Albini wrote, like an open letter to the people, where he listed all the ways that record labels were trying to screw you over. And I had read this letter, and I felt like I was armed with inside information about how Sub Pop was trying to screw me over. All Sub Pop wanted to do was put my record out. And record contracts are always terrible. You're never going to get one that's good. At the time, he was wearing a ring that said Murder City Devils on it. I was like, why do you have a Murder City Devils ring on? He said, when they signed the contract, they put it in there as like, you have to wear a ring that says Murder City Devils on it. And I was like, what a dumbass punk rock thing to do. Like, they probably lost 10% of their royalties because they were thinking about something like that. I'm going to deal in. And there's this episode that I remember very clearly, sitting in his office where I actually put my feet up on his desk and said, let's talk turkey. He doesn't remember it that way. He has a different memory of this moment, but there was a moment where I torpedoed my relationship with him based on the fact that I was essentially saying that his contract he was offering me was a ripoff. And he eventually was like, you know what? Like, I don't need your band as much as you need my label. I look back and go, what would have happened if I'd put out a record on Sub Pop? My life would be different. I don't know how much different. But that was a hubristic moment of thinking I was a bigger deal than I was. And thinking that I had some kind of, that I was valuable. And I had yet to prove I was valuable. And boy, I learned hard from that. I didn't put my feet up on anybody's desk for many years. Now, if you invite me into your office, I'll put my feet right up on your desk. But it's because I can't get fired now. I don't have a job. You can't fire me. But I regret it. And I'm friends with John Poneman now, but it's always there. That little tinge of disrespect I showed him. Anyone else? Do you got one last question? It looks like Kate is standing. People are still here. Nobody ran. Even my daughter has remained mostly quiet. She's suffering right now because whenever I'm on stage, she feels like it's really that we should be on stage. And she's like, how do I get up there? So a last question, anybody? Last curiosity? Yes.
So you mentioned, the support of your peers and how that sort of cultivated your development as an artist. But were there any mentors or, anyone who preceded you who you learned from, who changed the course of your career?
The thing about mentoring young musicians is that, older musicians are really threatened by younger musicians because it's a young person's game. And if you are 35 and a 25-year-old is like nipping at your heels, you have to be pretty generous to say, let me help. Seattle's famous for being that way. There were people like that moment with Ken or Scott McCoy from the Young Fresh Fellows and numerous other bands. And REM, right? He used to come to Seattle band shows. Like if your band had 100 people at it, one of them might be Scott McCoy at any given moment. And that was incredibly thrilling, that you would have this eminence at your show. But in my case, there were two people that really helped me, and one of them was They Might Be Giants. I opened for them, and John Flansburgh said, hey kid, come here. And he said, why don't you open for us? And we toured with them, and he just really powerfully kind of schooled me. But the other was Amy Mann. I was playing a show in California at Largo in LA, and I said to the audience, I'm going to play an Amy Mann cover. I'm a big fan of her music, and this club is kind of where she made her bones, her LA scene. And I played a song of hers, and afterwards I got off stage, and the stage manager said, she's here tonight. And I was just like, and she came backstage and walked right up to me and was like, you really fucked up my song. I was like, yeah, I know. But she immediately said, let's be friends. And just had her take on everything that was available to me. And it was just invaluable. She had no reason to. She didn't benefit, right? Financially or otherwise, from being my sounding board, but she was. And I owe a lot to her. And I wonder whether the fact that, I still wonder, how come she singled me out? But I tried to do it to young musicians because I missed it when I was young. I wished people had helped me, and I have nothing to lose anymore. And it is something that happens here. Seattle is very generous compared to other similarly sized cities. I mean, our whole music commission, the whole idea that we are trying, even at a government level, to try and make this city like a place that fosters creativity is like a generosity that you won't find in a lot of places. So, I mean, and that goes for everybody, right? You can all mentor somebody. There's always somebody that's like subtly asking you for help. Do you want to end our session? We've closed the gates now.
Yes, and it is 7 o'clock,
Oh.
so would love to, if everyone's ready. Anyone have a burning question for John? All right, well, thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. I hope that was useful. I'll stand around too if you're too embarrassed to shout out a question.